Hello?
Hello?
Okay. Welcome to season 2, episode 15 of the Educators Room podcast. I'm your host, Franchesca Warren, and today we have the Educators Room writer, Ruben Brosbe. Ruben, how are you this evening?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. We've had a little bit of technical difficulties, but as teachers, we bounce back and we keep it moving, right?
That's right. Yeah,
So, right. Can you give everybody a little bit of your background in education? Tell us what you teach, where you teach, where you got your degrees from, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Well, I'm currently teaching in a fourth grade inclusive classroom. So we teach special education and general education students in a public school in Harlem. It's my first year teaching there, and it's my 8th year teaching elementary school in New York City. I became a teacher through New York City Teaching Fellows, and that happened in 2007. So I've been teaching for 8 years and 10 years in education overall.
Okay. And you currently teach where in New York City? Like in what borough or what part of the city?
I'm teaching at PS 194 in Harlem.
Okay. So it's excellent to have you. And tonight we're going to talk about teacher resistance. So before we get into this conversation, what is teacher resistance? What is it, and why do teachers need to resist?
Well, resistance is a word that a lot of people have been talking about in the context of the recent presidential election. I think it's just an idea that a lot of people are thinking about with regards of resisting hate, resisting injustice, resisting things that aren't okay, not just in our political arena, but also in our classroom. So I think teacher resistance is a part of saying that we as educators have a job to do in participating in resistance as well, and making sure that the young people that we are in charge of educating, that they know right from wrong, and that they know how to stand up against injustice when they see it and when they hear it.
Perfect. So let me ask you this. On the Educators Room, we get a lot of people who say, you guys are a very left-leaning organization. We don't address conservative viewpoints. And so one of the things I want us to talk about before we get to speaking about anything else is the notion about this being a Republican or a Democrat view. So can you talk a little bit about, because we talked about it before we went on air, about how this really affects all of us, regardless if you're Republican, conservative, a liberal, in between. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that for me, like the biggest issue is just understanding that I don't think any Republican would want to say that it's a left or a liberal issue to teach young people that hate speech is wrong. I think that we all can agree that we want our young people to know that bullying is wrong, and that making hateful statements about other people based on their religion or their country of origin, these things don't have a place in our society, and they don't have a place in our classrooms. So I definitely have gotten pushback that people think I'm somehow trying to indoctrinate the young people in my classroom. But more often than anything, I'm really building on what I'm hearing them say and what I'm hearing them talk about. And what I'm hearing them say is that they are concerned about things that they see in the world around them, that they know to be related to racism, that they see related to, they don't use the word xenophobia, but they know that we're not treating people from different countries fairly. So I don't really see it as a political issue. I think that we all have a stake, and I think that we all have an agreement that we want to treat young people with respect, and we want to teach them to treat others with respect. So I don't see that as really a partisan issue.
Right. This election season has brought out the ugliness with a lot of people, and a lot of people who I think are not concerned with making our great nation as as inclusive as it can be. So when I hear people talk about, oh, this is, you know, a liberal viewpoint, this is liberal, I kind of question their own interactions with their students. Because regardless of where you teach at, whether you teach with all Caucasian students, whether you teach with all Latino or African American students, whether you teach students who practice Islam, who are Christian, we can all have the common belief that, like you said, hate language will not be accepted and bullying is not acceptable. So which leads me to ask, you know, we have our 45th president of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump, will be inaugurated on Friday. And whether you voted for him or not, you can, I mean, if you have to look at facts, you can say that there was a lot of hate language from him during, and his supporters during his campaign. Does that mean all of his supporters? No. But from what was viewed on television, there were people who advocated for certain things for people in our population. And so I have to ask, what made you decide this is the time now for us to resist? And what are we resisting?
Well, I think it's important is that, like, for me, as a white person, you know, I'm kind of conscious to the fact that, like, November 8th for me felt like a big wake up call, but I also know that, you know, I have people in my life I care about, people of color, who are saying, you know, that was just another Tuesday, as far as, you know, the history of racism and other types of oppression in this country. But even given the history of the country, I do feel that we are at a point where we're feeling and seeing a rise in language and in policies that are going to be really harmful to people. So this feels like, even though the time has always been right to teach resistance, it feels like more urgent than ever, because we have a shift in power where we have kind of in some ways, an explicit support, and in some ways just like a lack of resistance to really hateful and damaging rhetoric. So I think now's the time to start doing this work if we haven't already. I see a lot of people who are feeling afraid or angry or a sense of urgency that they haven't. So now it seems like the time to capitalize on this energy. And I think that it's a way of realizing that this is something that I can do as a teacher, that we all have ways that we can contribute right now to looking out for one another. And this is my role in that larger work.
And, you know, a lot of people, and it's really brave of you and the people who started this resistance campaign. So before we get into it, tell us what the resistance campaign is about. Like, what is the tenets of it? Because I shared it on the Educators Room Facebook page a day or two ago, but some people might not have saw it. So what is it? Like, what exactly is it? What does it entail teachers to do? And those type of things.
Okay. So basically, Teach Resistance is just an attempt to join in the longer and larger work of anti-bias education. That's how I would explain it. To be more specific or more clear, it's about teaching the young people in our classrooms that this is what injustice has looked like, this is what injustice does look like, and this is how people of all different backgrounds have fought injustice in their lives. So we're talking about really sharing stories from history and from present of injustice. So we have a kindergarten lesson that's based on a book, One, by Catherine Otoshi. It's a very popular book, best-selling picture book, and a lot of schools use it to talk about bullying. And I think that's a great starting point, because I think that when we talk about injustice, it often manifests itself in an interpersonal way, right?
Right.
I think that's the way that is most real to a lot of the young people in our classrooms.
Wow.
We also have lesson plans that look at more larger or historical issues. So I wrote a lesson plan based on a book called Poet, which is about an enslaved African man who taught himself to read, and then he became a famous poet, and he kind of used his art, he used his writing to push back against the injustice of slavery in America.
Right.
So I think that teacher resistance is both about unearthing stories that our kids aren't exposed to as much as they should be. And I think that in itself is an act of resistance of, you know, bringing these narratives to light, thanks to the help of the authors who wrote these books. And I think the other half of it is saying, like, these are role models we can look after.
Right.
There's, in the story one, there's the character one who stands up against the character who's bullying. And so we as adults and the young people in our classroom can say, oh, I can follow that lead. You know, I don't have to follow along with the bullying behavior. I can push back against it.
Mm-hmm.
And we can also look at other role models from history and say, oh, I can use the arts. I can use writing. I can use my voice to speak out against things that are wrong. And so I think that's what our goal is. So the teacher resistance toolkit that we design has some sample lesson plans for grades K-5, and then it has a long appendix of other resources to teach about the workings of our democracy, and to also teach about different aspects of respecting and understanding other cultures.
Perfect. Now, that's a really important point, because sometimes I think people, when we say social justice or we say resistance or we say bullying, people perceive that as, if it doesn't happen to me or my students, or I'm not aware of it, it's not something that I should talk about. And, you know, we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago about teaching, and teaching is a political act. And so what do you say for those teachers who say, you know what, I really think that you keep politics out of the classroom. Our kids don't need to know about this. Just let's keep it about what the content says. And you teach elementary school, and I have a 6-year-old who is very, very concerned with race. And it didn't happen until probably late fall, where he started asking me a lot of questions. Mom, am I black? Mom, am I brown? Mom, what am I? Well, who is this? Who is Donald Trump? Who is Hillary Clinton? Like, he was very interested. And I was like, where are you getting this stuff from? But the tidbits that he would see on TV, the things he would hear on shows that he watched, the things he would hear at school, he's very observant. And so I say that to say, you know, I'm a middle class as a teacher can get. I live in a nice neighborhood. My kids have never had racism happen to them that I know of. But why do we need to teach kids about resistance? What is it about, other than like the bullying aspect of standing up for yourself? Why do they need to know? What do you say to teachers who say they don't need to know about this? This is not our role. What do you say to that?
That's a tough question, because I mean, it's connected to so many other bigger questions. I mean, for one, I think people really say it's not our role because a common thing that I hear is that people say it's not the role of the teacher because we should leave that to families. And so one thing that brings to mind for me is just the historical disconnect between families and schools. Like, I actually feel like families and schools should be collaborating on this kind of work, and not that teachers should be leaving it to families. I think families and teachers should be working together to design this kind of education. But I guess the other, response I might have is just that when you choose not to speak about these issues and choose not to teach about these topics, you're not furthering justice in any way, and you're not protecting young people in your classroom anyway, because with or without your participation in the conversation, it's happening around you, and it's happening around the kids that you work with. They're experiencing these things with or without your interaction. And by speaking up, you can kind of validate their fears, the concerns, their questions. By being silent on it, then they are then left to kind of make sense of it on their own, or they're kind of getting a message that this conversation is not allowed to be had at all, which I think, as educators, we believe in curiosity. We believe in nurturing curiosity and inquiry in our students. So it's hard for me to imagine another type of conversation where we would just tell the young people, well, that's for you to figure out completely on your own.
Right.
Right.
And I think sometimes we don't give students enough credit for what they know or
Exactly.
what they hear. And we
Mhm.
say that, oh, no, that's a parent's job. But a lot of times our kids spend more time with us as adults than they spend with their parents. And so a lot of them, for whatever reason, they look up to teachers and they want to hear our opinions, and not so much our political opinions, but our opinions on right from wrong. Because
Mhm.
I've found that a lot of kids, they don't have that moral compass. And so they come to school with a set of beliefs that are not morally correct or not morally acceptable, and so they look to us to kind of say, is this right? Should I be doing this? So we've kind of danced around the issue. We've talked about it a little bit, but really the elephant in the room, I believe, is the election of Donald Trump.
Mhm.
And for us at the educators room, during election season, we had a lot of conversations about, is he good for education? Is Hillary Clinton good for education? I think we both decided that neither were really good for education, but a lot of writers, because of their political viewpoints, we had some very heated discussions on the Facebook page and our private group. And I can remember specifically, we have a writer who is a American government teacher, and he is a conservative, and he's very vocal about him being a conservative.
Mhm.
But one of the things that he said very early on was that Donald Trump does not embody what I believe conservatism is. And he got a lot of pushback from people who
Mhm.
said, basically, you're not a Republican, or how dare you speak on this? Just a lot of how dare you. So I have to ask, with the election of Donald Trump, what have you seen with your students and how they respond to him? How do you, and your colleagues, because I think we're dancing around the issue on why we need resistance, but a lot of it is the election of Donald Trump and what was said and what was shown in his rallies. And so talk about that.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of us, he is the impetus or kind of the inciting incident for why we're caring about how to do this work now. I will say that teach resistance, we are trying to keep it kind of distinct from Donald Trump in a way, just because we don't want it to be accused of kind of taking sides in a partisan way. But I mean, for me personally and transparently, obviously, I'm totally opposed to Donald Trump as our president. What he stands for and what he speaks about just goes against the values I believe in as an American. And when I think about my students, I know that they are afraid, they are angry, and they are anxious because of the election of Donald Trump. I have families in my school who are immigrants who are worried about what's going to happen. I have one student who was worried that his mom was going to be deported, and that who was going to take care of him, was what he expressed to me. Um, and I don't know their immigration status, so I don't know if it's an unfounded fear and she's actually a naturalized citizen or not. But whether or not she's documented, or regardless of her status, that fear is there, and that's a lot for a 9-year-old to have to carry day to day. I have other students who, they have said things like Donald Trump plans to bring back slavery, or he's plans to send Black people back to Africa. And these are obviously very exaggerated, outsized statements. Like, these are, I wouldn't say that they're grounded in anything that Donald Trump has actually said.
Right.
I think that fear comes from a real and valid place, right? Like, they see what's going on. They know what's up. Like, they may have, I don't know where this exaggeration comes from, but it's connected to the tone of things, right? It's connected to what they're sensing and feeling and hearing when they watch Donald Trump on the news or hear about his supporters or see things that are going on. So that's what I'm seeing and hearing and sensing in my classroom, is just generally a large feeling of fear and anxiety and anger. And so that's, for me, another motivation for teacher resistance, is because I don't want my students to feel afraid or helpless. And I want them to see that they, even as young people, have a lot of things they can do to fight injustice.
Right. Because a lot of people will say, I can hear now people who will say, Donald Trump didn't say any of those things, and this is all unfounded, and this is just a liberal way. But in reality, we have seen across the country there be an uptick of hatred towards Muslims, attacks. We've heard elected official refer to the president and the first lady as chimps and monkeys. Endorsing campaigns of people wearing badges, identifying if they're Muslim, a database. So these are things that are real, that are happening. Whether it's happening where we live or not, or the school that we're in or not, these are things that are happening. We're seeing schools across the country. I just read a story last week where a Muslim girl, somebody tried to yank off her hijab and told her to go back to her own country. We've seen stories at basketball games where people have taken Trump signs to an all minority team and told them to go back to where they come from. So whether you agree or not, these things are happening. So what do you do if you are a teacher and you are a conservative teacher and you may have voted for Donald Trump? What do you say to those teachers, or how do you get them into the resistance piece and understanding that this hate language from people around the country, from people who are supposed to represent all of us, how do you get them to understand about what's happening and how it affects our students? Because sometimes as adults, we have this bad where we say, well, it's not affecting me, so it doesn't matter. But when we do that with kids, regardless if you're teaching in rural America or in urban America or in, overseas, how do you get those teachers to at least find common ground in what you guys are doing?
I mean, I think I have a lot of thoughts on that. First of all, I just really appreciate what you said about the fact that, like, okay, so maybe Donald Trump didn't say anything about bringing back slavery, and that's an exaggeration. But we have enough real evidence out there. Like, we don't need to debate why my students have this exaggerated claim in their minds when there's so many real things out there that are happening that require a response from us. And so I guess when I think about what I would say to someone who's a teacher that voted for Donald Trump, I guess I would just ask them, what are your values? What do you want to see our country look like? What do you want to see in the future of how people are treating one another? And what can you do to help achieve that? Like, beyond economics or whatever your motivation is, like what is your part right now as an educator, as someone who's supposed to be cultivating our next generation of citizens? Like, what does citizenship look like to you? And how can you cultivate citizenship in a way that includes compassion and care for one another? I really don't see those as being partisan values.
Right. As we talk about this, and people will get upset, and I was talking to another teacher about this. I think teachers, sometimes we are too invested in both parties that we can't think clearly about what's best for us as teachers and what's best for students.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I say that partisanship should have no effect on anything in education, because whether I'm a teacher of color or whether I'm a Caucasian teacher or whatever teacher I am, based on the needs for me as an educator and based on what my students need, most politicians don't look out for the students we serve and us as professionals.
Mhm.
And so when teachers come to me and they say, I just believe this is a very liberal or this is very such and such, my first question is what's best for students and what's best for teachers?
Mhm.
Because we had this big discussion about before he was elected, what would Donald Trump do for teachers? And collectively, the decision was that he's not going to do anything but bring a lot of school choice, which is going to destroy public schools, which is going to ultimately hurt our profession when we have all of these schools competing for the same students. So I say that to say, if you're a teacher and it is January 16th, you go back to school on January 17th. Today we're observing Martin Luther King's birthday. What would be the first step for you as a teacher to resist bullying and hate language? What would be your first step? What would you tell a teacher who's maybe on the edge of, it doesn't really affect me, but I know it's wrong? So what would you tell that teacher the first thing they would need to do?
I would say if they think it's not affecting them, or even those who think it is and they're not sure where to start. I mean, the first place is just like open space up in your classroom for a conversation. Just ask the people in your classroom, like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling about the election or about what's going on in the world around us right now? And I would predict that there's going to be some surprising responses, like kind of the way you describe being surprised by your 6-year-old. Like there's a depth of knowledge and a lot of curiosity and a lot of strong feelings out there. And I would guess that if we make space to listen, we're going to see the need that we might not know is there otherwise.
I like that space for listen, because I think sometimes, we get so excited or so angry and we don't listen. We don't actually say, well, you know what, that might be a little bit hurtful. You know what, maybe that's not right. And so we get so, in our emotions that we don't think, is this something we really should be a part of? Is this something that we really, don't we really think that this is right? So I agree, but that listening piece is so hard. When you believe so strongly about certain things. Let me ask you this. I know your time is limited, but I have to ask, what do you do if you work in a school? Let's say you're in Middle America, Oklahoma, and you are a teacher who, let's say you voted for Donald Trump or you didn't vote. Let's say you voted for Bernie Sanders or whoever, Ben Carson. And you notice, in your heart that, kids maybe are being a little bit meaner to one another after this election, that the language has changed, and, you're starting with this compassion. What do you do when you're at a school where you're in the minority in the sense of bringing resistance to children, teaching them about social justice, letting them know that it's okay to speak out when something is wrong?
I think I struggle with a good response to that. I think on the one hand, I feel like using the right words and teaching specific language is really important. I think kids need to be able to name racism and name misogyny and name these different things that exist. So on the one hand, I feel that. But on the other hand, I feel like if you need to adapt the language to your community and you need to kind of focus on, all right, so my school district is having an anti-bullying initiative, and I'm going to use that as the framework for the conversations that we're going to have. I guess I'm not sure if I really answered your question. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's probably policies and initiatives happening at your school or in your district that are about respect, about teaching respect to one another. So I feel like we already have a mandate to do this work. In New York City, we have something called Respect for All. And I'd say that anti-bullying has been such a trend in schools for the last, I don't know how many years.
Right.
I think educators have a mandate, and then you use that mandate to go beyond just kind of a colorblind, like, let's all be nice to each other, and actually start looking at some specific examples. But I think that Oklahoma, Ohio, Wisconsin, wherever we're talking about, I think educators have been tasked with fighting bullying, and we can use that as an entry point to these other conversations as well.
I think that's important. I think you talked about entry point, and I think that that's something that is a very easy way to start the resistance, figure out what's your entry point. So I have to ask you, can you tell everybody where they can get information about Teach Resistance, and what are you going to be doing on Inauguration Day? Because I think that is a hot topic. I can remember 8 years ago and 4 years ago here in Georgia, where certain school districts, certain parents did not want their students to watch President Obama give his inauguration speech. For whatever reason. But what are you going to do with your students on Friday? Are they going to watch the inauguration? Are you going to talk to them beforehand? Are your students even interested in watching it? Like, what is your plan on that day?
Well, I plan to use the 4th grade lesson that I wrote based on the book Poet, which is the biography of George Moses Horton. So that's kind of my commitment, is this Friday. I will be having some time to talk with the students about how they're feeling about the inauguration. What are some of their fears and concerns? And I'm going to use that as an entry point to say, well, what are some things that people can do when they're worried about these kinds of things? And here's a story about someone who, found himself fighting against one of the most terrible injustices that we've ever had in this country, but he found his way. And I'm also going to talk with my co-teacher about possibly making some space to do some other writing. The lesson that I wrote includes some poetry writing.
Right.
Kids are going to write about what freedom means to them. But I think to give them some space to reflect on the inauguration, I might ask them if they want to write letters. Either they can write letters to President Obama about how they're feeling about the end of his presidency, or they can write letters to President-elect Trump about what they hope he will do as president. And I really just, more than anything, I want them to feel and know that they have many ways to advocate for themselves, starting with speaking out.
Perfect. So I have to ask, this is the question that I try to ask all of my guests. The last question of the podcast is, if you were the Secretary of Education, you're about to start your term, what would be 3 things you would immediately do?
That's a tough question.
Or just one thing. If you can only think of one thing, that's fine.
I think the first thing I would want to do is start a task force or something dedicated to figuring out how to legally address segregation in our country, and how to really make that a priority, since it hasn't been on the federal government's part for like 30 years now. I would want to think about teacher preparation, and how we think about bringing people into the work, and bringing people in who are qualified and committed to doing the work, and also qualified to teach kids of all backgrounds. So thinking about teacher preparation and how we're preparing people. You shared that article recently from the Atlantic about how we're preparing teachers to talk about racism and other forms of oppression.
Right.
Also, how are we bringing in more teachers of color to teach our kids? And I guess the third thing I would want to think about is how are we compensating educators? So I don't know what the federal government would be able to do on that, but thinking about ways to show more respect for the work that we do, put our money where our mouths are.
Well, that's good. That's all great stuff. So tell everybody where they can find the lesson plans for Teach Resistance, where they can find you, and what's your next move in education.
Okay. So you can find all of our resources at teachresistance.tumblr.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is also Teach Resistance. You can follow us on Twitter at TeachIn, TEACHIN 2017. And you can also find me at BLOGSBE, Blogsby. And my plan is, I'll be here teaching in Harlem as long as they'll let me. So that's where you can find me.
Oh, that's awesome, Ruben. Thank you for being here and for being so open. This is a difficult topic. And I think for the next 4 years, I mean, we've been doing this for 5 years, but we're going to continue to have these conversations, and people are going to be uncomfortable. People may not like it, but I think as educated adults, as educated professionals, we should be able to talk about certain things without name calling, without accusations. And if you feel a certain way, that is fine. I noticed that you have been very vocal in saying when you have an article, especially when you talk about social justice, and people will say, respond back, you're always really respectful in saying, can you give me what's your evidence about that? So I just like how you move in that sense. And I think that, this is just a start of very difficult conversations. So guys, you will find in the show notes all of the avenues to reach Ruben, to find out about the teacher resistance, and check us next time. We're going to be talking to a financial planner about how we can start to save for retirement. Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.